I'm so thrilled to introduce Greg Sarafin to you. Greg is Global Managing Partner at EY, and EY is Global Alliance and Ecosystem Leader. In this role, Greg oversees strategy, enablement, and value creation derived from alliances, and included in that are joint business relationships more broadly. Greg has had a fantastic career leading up to this role, having a diversity of experiences, including starting a company and then heading one of the professional services P&L for one of the top units at IBM in North America. Greg has a unique strategic view of ecosystems and their role in unlocking value and scaling it for extreme advantage that Greg will talk through, and then we will have a robust question and answer session with them. So, Greg, over to you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate everybody's time, particularly whoever's in Australia. Wow. I hope this is valuable to you across the presentations today. So hi, everybody. I am Greg. I have just finished 8 years with EY as a partner, and before that I was an executive at IBM. My career actually started 40 years ago. I sold my first deal, Mayank, in May of 1983, which shocks me to say. Although I also say I'm only 2/3 of the way through my career, so I still plan to go for quite some time. Most of my career has been leading business functions of some sort or another. I did do a startup, as you noted, Mayank. It was not successful. So my hat's off to anybody like you that has created a successful and long-lasting startup. I really appreciate the effort and the ingenuity and so forth that needs to go into making that happen. So I'll just tell a little bit about why I'm here today talking about this. Like many of you in this community, I am responsible for partnering at my company. And I'll be very direct with you. I was drafted into that role 6 years ago. I did not seek to be the head of partner ecosystem at EY or anywhere in my career. It's a role that I viewed as risky, frankly. I'd come from direct sales roles, CRO roles, and account management roles, and there was a certain, and there still is a certain, in some industries, stigma attached to the function of running the partner ecosystem, the alliances, the channels, whatever words you use. And so I was frankly concerned, Mayank, about what that would mean in terms of my ability to impact client value and shareholder value in my company. Turns out I needn't have worried. I probably joined at the right time. As we've noted at the start of this call, we are entering an era of partnering as a primary route to working capital sharing and value creation. And I entered, just as I think that trend was really starting to pick up. And when I took my role, I went to the board after 60 days of reflection. I got 60 days to come up with a quote strategy. At the time, EY was a $33 billion business entity and was only doing about $1 billion a year in partnering revenues, which was a laggard amongst our peers for sure. Many of whom were in the 20 to 50% range, depending on who you looked at. But more importantly, we were missing an opportunity to serve our clients better than we were, because we all know that clients ultimately are looking for value. They're looking for you to bring value to them. They don't necessarily view the value you bring to them as just the value within the four walls of your company. They expect you to bring something broader to them. And that, of course, has been an increasing trend as well, certainly in the professional services industry. So I went to the board and said, all right, well, if you give me certain authority and certain investment and so forth, I will commit to 30% CAGR over 8 years. So from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 25, we're just finishing fiscal year 23 now. We'll grow from $1 billion to $8 billion. We'll grow to 15% of our revenues. We will have client impact and, blah, blah, blah. So that was where this all started. Now, did I Was I confident about the 30% CAGR? I was reasonably comfortable making that ambitious statement, but because I knew what our peers were doing and so forth. But still, it was probably one of the more audacious things I ever committed in my career, certainly in front of a board. Uh, I'm happy to report it worked out well. We will finish this fiscal year 23, so 6 years into the journey, at a 38% CAGR, finishing at about 7.5 billion. Now, there's still a lot more to go. That's going to be about 15% of our revenue this year. But the more important thing that I look at is the impact. What are the things we're doing in the market for our clients? It's not just the top line, but it's also the bottom line of the impact that we're having. And that's where I really feel very proud of the accomplishments of our team, and us as an organization overall, in pivoting our mindset and our thoughts about how we create value to increasingly be about partnering towards that value versus doing it just on our own. So that's a little bit of context about how I came to be here. The other piece of context I'll give you is, my day job is, overseeing the EY partner ecosystem. So I do all the things that probably many of you do. I do all the core enablement of all our relationships. We have 100 plus relationships now in our partner ecosystem. So all of them are important to, in some form or fashion, to somewhere in EY. And so we have a shared service and technology platform that we use to enable and serve all of our relationships. And then I pay particular attention to what we call our tier one relationships. So these are our most strategic global partners with whom we do the largest proportion of our co-investment, co-innovation, co-marketing, co-selling, et cetera. And so those are a direct responsibility of mine, and I have relationship handling teams around those relationships around the world, again, as many of you probably do. About 3 years into my role, we were on a maturity journey because we had almost zero maturity, and we were trying to, over the course of 8 years, get to a new definition of maturity 5. Frankly, we wanted to actually lead the market ultimately, not just catch up to it. I realized, because we had a partnership with a non-technology company, Procter & Gamble, that this was a very different kind of partnership than I had been used to up until that point. And I was probably missing something by just being myopically focused on the way we always partnered in the professional services industry with the way technology companies always partner. And so I set on a journey of taking a step back and saying, well, what is partnering? Are we being too myopic about how we think about partnering? Are there different ways of partnering that create value in channels and means that we don't do today, et cetera? So that is where I sort of went down the path of, okay, what should we be doing and how should we be thinking about it? And how should this be more of an overall corporate imperative and corporate strategy? And ultimately, not just for EY, but for our customers as well. Because if it's important for EY to partner to create value, isn't that also true of all of our customers? Shouldn't they also be thinking about customering to produce value? And so we started doing research. You referenced one of our more recent research studies, that CEO study that we did last year. We've done others. We've also worked with analysts. And that led us to publish a number of thought pieces. And those thought pieces then led to me getting pulled into meetings with initially tech company CEOs who wanted to understand, okay, how do you think differently about partnering than we think about partnering? But then it was interesting. I started getting pulled into meetings with non-tech company CEOs, pharma companies, energy companies, logistics companies, and so forth, who also wanted to understand, what is this partnering thing? Because we're hearing about it. Analysts are talking about it. We know it's a thing. We know that there are a lot of partner-led or ecosystem-led businesses out there, but they're all born in the cloud, aren't they? And that really doesn't apply to our industry, or does it, or how does it, and so forth. So then we started to say, all right, how, working with our strategy team, UI Parthenon, how can we sort of make sense of all this and put this together in a way that CEOs can understand? Because quite candidly, Mike, when I used to talk to CEOs, I would talk about what I did and what EY did and what a partner ecosystem function was. And I could tell in those conversations something was missing. And so what I'm going to share with you now is what was missing, what has now resonated with CEOs, and has also even sort of galvanized us internally to realize what our role is. And then relate it back to all of us in this community, about the importance of what we do and why what we're doing is so relevant to the C-suite, to the board, and to the capital agenda of every company in the world, not just the ones we serve, but every company in every industry. So that's a little bit of background. So without further ado, I'll just quickly get into how I just position this with CEOs. So the first thing I'll say is, look, I know you want to talk about partnering, but partnering is just a means to the true end. And the true end is something we call value orchestration. And value orchestration really comes about at the convergence of three forces that are happening today in the world. The first everybody is aware of, it's the ubiquitous availability of connected infrastructure. Uh, you can literally set up a business overnight that's global in scale, has no limits on data, storage, CPU, etc., connectivity. But that also means that companies can do things together at a much more meaningful level, much more quickly, much lower cost than they ever could before because of this ubiquitous, cost-effective infrastructure. So that's one mega trend or force that has been sort of driving us in a direction. Another is that we are seeing, particularly because of entering the age of social responsibility and building that into the capital agenda, that the traditional ways of measuring cost of capital and return of capital are no longer sufficient. Things like routes to circularity and alternative things like the value of data, the value of IP, and other things are increasingly part of the calculation of capital value and value exchange between parties. It's no longer just about flows of money. And so that's another mega trend that's happening. That's been really fueled by ESG regulation. And then I think the real mega trend that's sort of related to these other two is this sort of pivot from buying products and services to buying value outcomes with frictionless digital experiences, right? So all of us experience this both in our lives as consumers as well as our lives as buyers of services in the context of whatever business function we serve. And we all know the examples. I'll give just one as illustrative. If you're in the automobile industry today, you're selling automobiles. Tomorrow, will people be buying automobiles, or were they buying mobility experiences? And a mobility experience might include things like, hey, this week I need to travel up to the country. I need a pickup truck to haul some stuff. Next week I need a sports car to drive around. I need a limo in 2 weeks to drive me to the airport, etc. Instead of buying one vehicle or two vehicles, why don't I have the vehicle I need show up when I need it? And sometimes it'll have a driver and sometimes it won't. Well, that is a very complicated thing to do, yet that is probably where most analysts think that the industry is going. And so how do you, as a maker of automobiles, remain relevant if you could just end up being a supplier to whoever is ultimately providing that mobility experience? So this is the big pivot that we're seeing, and there's a version of that in every single industry. I won't go into all of them, but all of you serve industries, and I'm sure you can see, if you haven't already discussed in your own organizations, where these things are going. So those are the three mega trends. So if we go to the next slide, just two more slides, and then we'll get into the discussion. So we're underneath this, what we're doing is we're pivoting from industry value chain models, right, where the product and service is the center of focus, right, with customers being the marketplace from which to take share. Now, when I say the words industry value chain, what I mean is things like automotive, insurance, healthcare, etc. Ultimately, they end up in a consumer buying something and or a government buying something on behalf of their citizens. But then there's another type of value chain that's equally important. Actually, it's probably more important to most of the people in this audience. It's what we call the functional value chain. So industry value chain serves consumers and gives sort of the things that consumers use in their daily lives. A functional value chain is really about B2B, and it's about selling value to the finance function or the tax function or the HR function and so forth, right? So that's the B2B side of value chains. Many of us in this community probably at a minimum serve the B2B, but in some cases may also serve the B2B industry value chains. The point I'm making, though, is that these models are still about the product or service. They're not about the value outcome. If you go to the next slide, the big pivot that we're seeing, right, is that where there's an opportunity for these intermediaries, these value orchestrators, to come in and create that value outcome for whoever the end client is. It could be consumer, or it could be the chief finance officer, or it could be, some other buyer, either in a B2B or B2C context. And that value orchestrator is bringing together a lot of industry or functional value chains in order to create that outcome. So if I go back to the automobile to mobility experience, right? Automobiles are just a part of the mobility experience. You also need to bring the insurance in. You need to bring the financing in. You need to build the maintenance and the service in. You need to build the IoT and the measurement and so forth in, right? And so those come from a bunch of different industry and functional value chains that the value orchestrator stitches together. So when I have this discussion with CEOs, they go, okay, I get that. I see that. So what's the link? And of course, the answer is, the link is, in order to be a value orchestrator, you need to be really good at partnering, because these are primarily partnering strategies. They are not purely build and buy strategies. You're not, as Mercedes-Benz, going to build an insurance company and a bank and a network of maintenance trucks. They're going to go around and service the vehicles and so on and so forth and so on. You don't have the capital. You don't have the time. So either you're going to orchestrate it or somebody else will, and then you'll get pushed back in the value chain that you are at the front of today. And then they go, okay, so now tell me more about partnering. And that's when we get into the discussion of what we all do in this community, which is, partnering needs to be a function of your company, just like finance is a function of your company, tax, HR, IT, right? It needs to be something you major in. It's not something you minor in. And that function of your company is strategic. It's not secondary. And therefore, you need to elevate it to your C-suite. It is on par, if not more important now, with product development, which you might call innovation. You might call it R&D. You might call it the function of your chief product officer. Might be a combination of those things. It's on par with product. It's on par with corporate development. So transactions, arguably even more important in this model. And then if a CEO says, well, what if we don't anticipate being a value orchestrator? That's fine, but you're still going to be orchestrated. So if you want to even be a participant as the orchestrated versus the orchestrator, guess what? You still need to be good at partnering. And the reality is, for most companies to be relevant, you're going to need to do both. In some cases, you're going to be part of the value orchestration. In other cases, you will just be part of the orchestrated. But either way, you're going to need to major in partnering. You need a chief partner ecosystem officer. And they're going to need all the things that we talked about even earlier in this discussion. You're going to need to automate that function. Every function needs its digital platform, its digital core. SAP, who's another guest today, has very successfully positioned itself as the 70% market holder for the digital core for the finance function. On the revenue side, we know that Salesforce has, the majority market for revenue management and CRM, and, you can go down the line. So there is certainly a need for digitizing these processes and even defining these processes and defining the KPIs, right? So when I talk to CEOs, I say, look, we've grown at a 38% CAGR, but at what cost? Well, the indirect cost of our growth has been about a half a point of earnings per year. So that's all the middle and back office functions that we do to enable partner ecosystem. Then the other cost we have is cost of sales. So that's all the relationship handling, go-to-market, et cetera. There, we don't measure it as a pure cost. We measure it as a ratio of cost to earnings growth. And our last fiscal year, for every dollar we spent in relationship handling and go-to-market in our partner ecosystem, we returned $5 of earnings growth to the company, right? So that's the other thing that really gets CEOs to take note is, oh, you're not just running a function that the way we used to think about it, which is you're like an overlay. We can't really articulate what your value is. You're running the function and you're running it on a set of KPIs and metrics that are measurable, provable, and demonstrable of the value that you're creating. And, oh yeah, by the way, you're unlocking your ability to be value orchestrators, or at a minimum participate in value orchestration models effectively. So that is a real quick run through of what I usually take a couple of hours to take CEOs through. But since all of you are in this community, I'm sure that you're kind of connecting the dots here and resonating with some of this, I hope. And with that, Mayank, I'll stop talking and I'll start listening and discussing and answering any questions people might have as a result of that.
Hey, Greg, that was a fantastic set of slides that primed our conversation. So before I dive into the first question, now let me introduce Nirav Desai, who's at WorkSpan. He's our Vice President of Consulting and SI Ecosystems. And Nirav has a rich history in working with many of our many companies in the SI and consulting ecosystem, and he understands how these trends apply to that segment of the market. So welcome, Nirav.
Awesome to have you, Greg. I know always, it's a privilege to work with you and many of your peers in the industry as well. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Greg, you made a couple of remarkable points. Let me start with one. Right, traditionally, partnering has been thought of as an overlay service function to sales or marketing or product development.
Right.
If you're on the build side.
Yes.
And as ubiquitous digitized infrastructure becomes available and the cost of transacting across company boundaries decreases, many strategic roles can now be played through orchestrating value directly for the customer, not just creating value for an internal function. And that radical shift allows partnering teams to position themselves or start new initiatives that directly unlock value for the parent company, right? And not through unlocking value or making efficient of another function uh, more efficient, but rather directly contributing to the CEO's objective or the CEO's goal.
That's right.
So is is there a need to change our vocabulary as partnering leaders of how we communicate what we do internally to get a seat at the CXO table and elevate our partnering initiatives to be core company initiatives? What advice would you have for the functional partnering leaders who are in this audience today?
Well, I don't know that I'd recommend you go talk to your CEO about value orchestration. That might be a long stretch from where you are to having that conversation. But here's what I would recommend, and this is what I did, frankly. First thing you need to do is to be very clear that you're orchestrating a set of business processes, right? You are a function, whether you're recognized as a formal function or not. You are running a function of your company. There's a set of processes that function is responsible for as the steward of. Those processes cross into other functions of your company. They cross into your direct sales, they cross into your marketing, they cross into your product development, they cross into finance, revenue rec, tax, etc. But you should be really clear about what those processes are, and you should start to measure and make those processes apparent to people, because often they're invisible. Second, you should be really clear about the value that you're creating, right? You're not just a route to market, you are a route to value, and you should be articulating what that value is, particularly in terms of what is the incremental value you're creating. Because it goes back to that fear I had 6 years ago. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be an overlay now, right? What did I do wrong in my career? And it took a while before I realized, no, we're bloody not an overlay. We're actually creating net new value. We're just really bad at communicating it, both to ourselves and to the market. So get really good at communicating the value that you're creating and quantifying it. And then, most importantly, connect that back to the cost that you are, because you are probably viewed, as I am, as a drag on earnings, right? You're an SG&A cost. You're certainly not cost of goods sold. Never are, right? Or rarely are, I should say, not never. And so, as an indirect cost, you are a drag on earnings ultimately, and therefore you're implicitly a capital allocation. You're a component of the capital allocation strategy or resource allocation strategy of your organization. So, articulating how that how you're spending that earnings, which is an opportunity cost for the firm, and returning on that earnings. That's why I threw out those two metrics that I think are important, right? And by the way, separating SG&A, separating the S and SG&A from the G&A. G&A is an indirect cost. Your job is to drive that to zero. At EY, we have got 75 people in a shared service team in India. And in the Philippines, we've spent $15 million on tech. We're now hopefully about to close something with WorkSpan to include that in our tech stack, right? Because at the end of the day, we've digitized the heck out of our processes internally. What WorkSpan will do, of course, is allow us to digitize our processes externally as well. Right. That's ultimately the interesting thing about this function is you're the stewards of business processes that are both internal and external across multiple partners. Right. So these are the things that I would recommend to us as stewards of these functions is to start to really articulate that running a function. Don't necessarily call yourself a chief partner ecosystem officer yet, or talk about value orchestration, but demonstrate that you're orchestrating value, that you're enabling value orchestration, and give hard KPIs for the money you're spending and the return the organization is getting on that spend in terms of incrementality, incremental value to the organization, not just an overlay.
Spot on, Greg. I think this is a very timely conversation to have, especially in this year when people are fearing recession. There are companies are cutting costs and figuring out who plays a core function where they need to invest, and then everybody else who needs to cut, right? And so, in that environment, understanding the initiatives that the partnering team has, the business processes that the partnering team owns that delivers those initiatives, that contributes directly to the corporate objective or the business strategy that is playing out in each company, becomes very relevant. And towards that point, how to communicate that value along with metrics and cost indicators. I think that builds a
It's
good case.
critical, right? Resource allocation at any company is always a challenge. Everybody's claiming what they do is important. It needs to be funded. Often capital allocation, it can be a beauty contest at many companies, as can budget allocation. And so in order to get an appropriate allocation for the function that you are the steward of, you need to articulate that value very clearly. And not to put too fine a point on it, when everybody comes to me and says, well, we need to reduce the cost of this function, I go, okay, so tell me what you're spending $1 on that's going to return you more than $5 of earnings growth. And it very quickly becomes a different conversation, right? And so that is what, really turned the tide in terms of, how we at EY are able to, allocate correctly into this function versus the other functions versus the capital agenda more broadly of the firm, and how we're advising some of our clients to do the same thing.
So, Greg, I'll ask one question, and then Nirav, I invite you to present your perspective. So, Greg, one of the things that we have seen in partnering is sometimes you are the orchestrator, and sometimes you are participating in somebody else's orchestration. So you become the orchestrated, as you mentioned, right? And
Yes.
this is very true in large companies and small companies. Sometimes your core business value is orchestrator, even as a small business, a small company. And sometimes you have to play in somebody else's orchestration to tap into customer value creation. And a prime example of this is even very large companies today are tapping into the cloud companies like Amazon, Microsoft, or Google to participate in the value orchestration those public clouds are doing as things get migrated to the public cloud. And there you have to play a role in co-selling with Amazon, or co-selling with Microsoft, or co-selling with Google. And then as you're co-selling with these large companies, you become part of the orchestrated. And often my observation here is that it's very easy to articulate the return on capital or the value that is accumulating to the company for a much lower cost basis if you participate effectively in somebody else's ecosystem that is being orchestrated, right? And so those investments in co-selling with some other companies might be one of the initiatives that the partnering teams could look into this year as they demonstrate value and shift towards this value orchestration framework?
Yeah, so great points. So yes, I'm smiling because, of course, we in the professional services side want to be the orchestrator, and of course, our friends at Microsoft and SAP and elsewhere believe they're the orchestrators, and we're the orchestrated, right? And sometimes we are. It's actually kind of goes back and forth, right? Um, here's how I actually work through that. Is I go, look, whether you think you're the orchestrator or I think I'm the orchestrator, great. At the end of the day, when we show up for the client, have we co-invested in something that's unique, distinct, reduces time to value, reduces risk, provides a higher value outcome for the client? And how are we co-investing working capital together to build those things? It can't just be route to market. It can't just be, oh, we're there recommending each other. They got a great product. They got great services. That's not value to a client. Sorry, it's really not. So for me, regardless of who thinks they're being orchestrated and who thinks they're orchestrating, sometimes it's more of a co-orchestrated model. And the real measure is the working capital that you jointly put together to create distinction, and the effectiveness with which you go to market together, the effectiveness of the motion, and the win rates that you generate as a result of those motions. But the other point I would make is, this goes back to, the C-suite. What is your business strategy relative to an orchestration model? Where as a business do you want to be an orchestrating entity? And where as a business do you want to participate in business models orchestrated by others? Not that different than the value chain model today, but the difference is in the value chain model, who am I supplying to and who am I buying from is really the question. But in the orchestration model, it's the former.
Superb, superb, superb. In orchestration, your identity is visible to the end customer, right? Whereas in a supply chain model,
You're
the
invisible.
the company is invisible. So
That's right.
it's really vital to a company for long-term success if you want to be visible to the customer and capture that value from the customer, like you showed in your slides. This shift in philosophy in partnering is amazingly important to do. Nirav, would you have a question that you want to follow up here?
Absolutely. So I think let switch topics. And Greg, I know you've talked about this in some of your other papers, or in fact demonstrated that as well, both internally with EY as well as with your customers. So today's modern technology and outcome-centric paradigms that you just talked about, are leading to very unique ecosystem models, right? I mean, these are not old generational one-to-one partnerships, but those that involve cross-industry partnerships or collaboration, or you talked about 7 ecosystem models, etc., which fundamentally co-create and deliver value both internally to the firm, to your partners, and most importantly to the customers as well. So how should organizations of today and tomorrow, and equally importantly the community here, the chief partner officers and the leaders, be on that cutting edge to look out for this a plethora of business models, and then imbibe and incorporate that within their organizations? Long story short, I think it's a complex world, right? So how do you kind of pick which model works for you best, and then how do you kind of be on the cutting edge so that you're driving value to the customers and competitive advantage to your firms as well? So any insights for you from you, the leaders here?
Yeah, here's how we think about it, and we advise CEOs to think about it. Instead of thinking about your product or service and who you can sell it to, think about the segment of the market that you want to orchestrate value for. What is that value? Why is it distinct? Why would they care? Why would they buy it from you? And the partners that you orchestrate to deliver that value. Once you identify those targets, then look at the available partners you already have or new partners that you may need to create in order to create that value proposition. That's probably going to be more than one partner.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's very little that's distinct and unique and solves a value journey for a customer or a value outcome for a customer that is just two companies, a tech company, a professional services company, or a pharma company and a tech company or whatever, right? So the But what you want to do is you want to create that little orchestrated model to be as compact as possible, because N is your enemy. The more numbers you have of partners in anything, the more difficult it gets to orchestrate, right? So there's a balance between, you want to create distinction and you want to cover that value end to end, but you don't want to do it with 50 partners because that's not sustainable. My rule of thumb is if you get beyond like 7 or 8 partners to create a unique value proposition, you probably should rethink the boundaries of the value proposition or how you're thinking about creating it. Then those partners need to come together. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about capital valuation, right? We're getting much better at valuing things like the value of data, the value of IP, the value of brand, the value of routes to market, routes to circularity, et cetera. So when you think about forming these multi-party partnerships and orchestrating them, if you're in the orchestration role, or even if you're in the orchestrated role, right? How do you make sure that the risk and the value that you're putting in to the ultimate outcome to the end client is being repaid in a return on capital that's acceptable? But you can't just think of it as revenue flows anymore. You also have to say, listen, I'm getting access to data, which I can then use to drive insights, to drive ancillary benefits for my company, or I'm getting access to customers that I would never even sniff at participating in this model. They would never know my brand but for participating in this model. Or I have routes to circularity where I now can reduce my green tax burden in Canada and Belgium and France and wherever these green taxes are. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can look at in these partner models, but you always start with, who is the end client? What is the value outcome that we're driving? What's the minimum viable set of partners? If I'm orchestrating, how do I do it effectively? And then all of us, whether the orchestrator or orchestrated, how are we calculating value exchange, not just as money, but as all of the forms of value, so that we can get the appropriate return on capital, risk adjusted, for the effort that we're all putting in to create this value proposition to begin with.
Hey, Greg, that's a perfect tee off to one of the audience questions that I'll introduce now. And Chip, could you be here to take more questions from the audience? So one of the questions I see is from Craig Gisberg. This points to the point you were just making about articulating the value that is being delivered. And I have a perspective here, but would love to hear your point of view on how to characterize it from soft to hard.
Yeah. So there's 2 answers. One, to the extent that you can do these orchestration models where you're creating unique things in the market that wouldn't exist but for the partnering, it's not over. I mean, it's not influence revenue anymore. It's incremental revenue. It's new revenue. It's a new value proposition, right? So that's one way to do it. Now, it's not always possible to do that because all of us still have our legacy sort of, channel and route to market types of relationships as well. So there, the way I've gotten past the quote stigma and suspicion of overlay is I have published a number of metrics internally. One of them, at least in our business, is that we know that all things being equal, our win rate on a typical deal when we get down to the final 3 or 4 in a selection process is probably about 30%. When we are in a partnering model, even if it's a bilateral model with SAP selling a finance transformation, our win rates go up by 20 points. And when we're selling against that, one of our competitors in that same situation is co-selling with SAP or being endorsed by SAP or any partner, it doesn't matter who, it goes down by 20 points. That's a 40-point spread. And then you can show mathematically what that does. The other thing I also point out is, in our particular company, there are certain companies we cannot partner with because we audit them, and it would create a mutuality of interest to partner with them. That's not appropriate for our job as auditors. So I also have a direct comparator. I can show that where we do work in non-SAP technologies, where we're the auditor, we are a fraction of the win rate and size of where we are doing it with SAP in finance transformation or supply chain transformation. It doesn't matter. So I actually have a means of demonstrating this, and then I can calculate that back up to, listen, it's, the relationship for finance transformation drives 90% incrementality, right? I can demonstrate that. When we're doing these unique, distinct value propositions, it's 100%, and then we have others where it's 50%. And again, I've used metrics, math, I've used analysis, I've used comparisons to competitors, etc., and I've gotten agreement on these multipliers and factors, so that okay, so we have 7.5 billion of partner revenue. How much of that is incremental? The answer is over 6.
Superb, superb. And just to round up my observations, Greg, marketing went through a similar stigma last decade, and we can take some lessons from how marketing was able to generate hard metrics around marketing sourced leads or pipeline or referrals, which sales was not directly sourcing, and they got credit for it. And then the incremental win rate from marketing influenced pipeline, which is exactly what you talked about. When you co-sell with SAP, your incremental win rates are entirely visible in the math across the pipeline that closed this quarter. Right.
Yeah. Although it's interesting you mentioned deal flow, right? Sourcing. Interestingly, I do not put as much value on sourcing. I do not expect my partners to, quote, bring us deals any more than I expect to bring them deals. I believe if we have a value proposition that we're appropriately at marketing, the deals will flow to us. And I don't care which side of the relationship it flows to, as long as at the end of the day, we're co-selling it. That's really what I care about. Are we selling the distinct value that we've created? If we are, we're going to win. And if we're not, it doesn't matter how it was sourced.
Excellent points. And I think this might be a great point to close this conversation. Greg, fantastic insights. The shift in the way of thinking from being a service function to a value orchestrator, I think is one of the fundamental theories that is powering ecosystem as a strategic growth vector in today's market. And thank you for leading that and articulating it for the rest of us.
Thank you again for having me. It's been terrific.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.